Hey everyone, welcome to a new lesson. Now we're going to talk about the orbit null. But first, let me tell you what a null object is. Basically, a null object is an empty layer that has all the properties that a visible layer has. It has position, it has scale, and it has rotation settings. So this null object will be used for tracking, for controlling the visible layers. Simply put, these null objects will act as a marker for the rest of the layers. So for example, right now I have these four monsters. They are from Freepik, and right now if I hit the rotation for each of them and I rotate them, they will rotate on their own anchor point, right? But what if I want they all to rotate from the center, like a wheel, like a spinning wheel? How do I do that? I could right click and pre-compose and create a pre-composition and rotate this pre-composition, but this is more work. So if I want to do that, all I have to do is to go to layer, new, and create a new null object. You can see that the null object is invisible. The only thing that we can see is a little square with some anchor points, and if we render this video, this animation, we won't be able to see the null object because this is an invisible layer. We see it here on the editor, on the viewport, but it won't be seen on the final composition. So you can see that this null object, we can move it as we would move any other layer. And if you open the settings, the properties, you can see that we have the anchor point, we have the position, we have the scale, we have the rotation, and of course the opacity won't work because it is an invisible layer. But we have all the rest of the properties. So how do we use a null object? If I want to rotate them all to the center, what I have to do is to take all these monsters and parent them to the null object. That means that the null object will be the parent for all these layers. So if this null object is the parent, that means that if I move this null object, it will move all the monsters. If I rotate this null object, I will rotate all the monsters from the center. So you can see that it's way easier than pre-composing because we are just going to move a single layer. So if I want these monsters to move from this point to this point, it's so much easier to do it with the null object because all I have to do is to create an animation with some keyframes for the null object's position, instead of having to create an animation for each of them independently. So the null object acts as a marker for the visible layers. So how does this null object applies to the camera? Actually, it's pretty simple. Let's create a camera. And let's make all these layers 3D. Let's delete this null object for now and go to active camera view, and let's change the position. Let me move all these monsters here. Alright, now I can move the camera like this, and I can play with the position of these monsters. And I can see how the camera works. and that's fine. But if I want to animate the camera, it can be a little troublesome because we have a lot of options, and moving the camera can be a little hard, can be a little annoying sometimes. We move the position, maybe we move the rotation as well. It can be a little annoying. So it's way easier to just create a null object and attach the camera to that null object and move the null object instead of the camera. And to do that, we don't even need to create a null object like this. All we need to do is to select our camera, right click, and this will open this new menu where we have this option called camera, and inside of this option we have the create orbit null. An orbit null is just a null object which is 3D and is already a parent to the camera. You can see the camera on the parent section. You can see that it's already a child of this null object. So we have here the null object. You can see this square with the anchors, and this null object is 3D. If we go to our custom view, you can see that here is the null object. Now, if I move this null object, it will move the camera as well. You can see how the camera is this pink box. You can see how the camera is moving because it is attached to the null object, because it is a child of the null object. So if I rotate, let me rotate this orbit null. If I rotate this, my camera will rotate as well. If I rotate it on the y-axis, it will rotate as well. Everything I do to the orbit null, to the null object, will be applied to the camera because it is the parent of this camera. So it's way easier to just animate the camera orbit null, because we can just, let's go again to the one view. Instead of moving the point of interest of the camera, instead of moving the position, the rotation for the camera, all I have to do is to create some keyframes and play with the position of the null. Let me play a little with the position. We can zoom in by changing the position into the Z-axis, and we are already creating an effect of zoom in and zoom out. So let's see how it looks. You can see we just created a very simple animation for the camera. Now, we're not animating the orbit null itself. We're actually animating the camera with the orbit null, because the camera is a child of the orbit null. So if we go to the custom view and we scroll over the timeline, let's select our camera, you can see how the camera is animated. And that's all done thanks to the orbit null. So you can see how much easier it is to just add an orbit null instead of animating the camera itself. Animating this would have taken longer time, and if we are going to create a complicated composition where we need a very long time of camera animations, it will be a nightmare to animate them here on the camera layer. It is so much easier to just animate it with the orbit null. Now I'm going to cut here because I'm going to open a new file that I've selected to teach you a little more about the null objects and the depth of field. Alright, I have this file. Of course, this file is from Freepik. You can see this wonderful animation. And now I have this in several layers. I have the front grass in one layer, the car in another layer, mountains is separated too, and finally the sky. So I'm going to place them all into different parts of the composition. And for that I'm going to activate the custom view one, which makes it so much easier, and I'm going to start placing them in different parts. For example, the front grass, I'm going to take the Z-axis handle and place it very much to the front. Let me activate the two views and make this view an active camera so that I can see that it doesn't get lost. Right now it's getting lost. Alright, like this, it's fine, and I'm going to move into the y-axis too. Now the car, I'll move the car also a little to the front so that it's separated from the mountains and the sky. Now the sky, I'm going to move it to the far part of the composition, and I'm going to increase this size so that I don't get any white spaces. For the car, I can move it to the y-axis a little, just a little bit, not too much. Right. The mountains can be a little farther and bigger too. So right now on the active camera it looks the same, it hasn't changed, but you can see that we have different layers and different positions. We could even increase this a little bit, take this further and take it to the top. So that this part, the front grass, is right in front of the camera. Now let's go to our camera settings, and on camera options I'm going to activate depth of field. Alright, now I will increase the aperture and look what will happen. I'm going to increase this a lot to 800 pixels, and you can see that now we are getting some depth of field. Now the focus is on the mountains, as you can see here. The focus right now is on the mountains, and the sky and the car and the front grass are out of focus. So how do I know where the focus is? By playing with this focus distance. If you move this, you can see, pay attention to this square here, to the point of interest. If I move this, you can see that this square is separated, and this is the focus of the camera. If I move this until it gets to the sky will be on focus. We can rotate a little here so that we can see exactly where the focus distance is. You can see that the focus distance is a little behind the sky. Right now it's exactly on the sky. So if I shorten this distance, I can make him focus on the car like this, or focus on the front grass. I can play with the aperture so that I can manage how much blur do I want. And of course, the best part is that we can actually animate this focus distance. For example, I will go from this point, from the grass, and I will go far behind until the focus is on the sky. I'm going to increase the aperture. So if I go to one view, I will have this. I start here, and I start focus on the car, now on the mountains, and finally on the sky. So this is really nice, and we are doing it very simply. Now let's create an orbit null. Remember, right click, camera, create orbit null. And now let's go to two views. Now here is the orbit null, and remember that if I move this, the camera will move as well. So I want the camera to zoom in into these objects. So I'm going to create a keyframe for the position right here, right on this point. We're going to create a keyframe, and now on second 3 I'm going to increase the distance on the z-axis. But I also want to change the position on the y-axis. So I'm going to take this keyframe and change the position on the y-axis to the top. So this will go like this. We could even stop right here and create a keyframe and remove this one and make the animation until this point. Like this. So remember, we didn't move the camera, but we moved the orbit null using this orbit null option. If you take a look at the camera, you can see how it moved into the sky because it is attached with the orbit null. If we didn't have the orbit null, we could have done the same thing, but it would be a much harder task. So that's the importance of the orbit null. Later on the practice of this section, we're going to learn a lot more from the orbit null, and we're going to practice with it, and we will polish anything that wasn't clear on this lesson. So let's go to the next lesson of this section.